Ever heard of a war named after flowers? Sounds pretty, right? Don't let the name fool you. The Wars of the Roses wasn't some polite disagreement in a garden. It was 30-odd years of backstabbing, betrayal, and bloody battles that ripped 15th century England apart. We're talking kings dethroned, nobles slaughtered, and a crown so hotly contested, it's a wonder anyone survived to wear it. So, grab a cuppa, settle in, and let's untangle this epic, messy, and utterly fascinating fight for the English throne. And hey, if you're enjoying this kind of historical deep dive, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us make more. All right, so picture this. England in the 15th century. It's not the England of Queen Elizabeth I with Shakespeare and the Spanish Armada, not yet. This is a bit earlier, and things are, well, a bit of a mess, to put it mildly. We're about to dive into a period that sounds rather romantic, the Wars of the Roses. Sounds like a lovely gardening competition, doesn't it? But trust me, it was anything but. We're talking about roughly 30 years of brutal, on-again, off-again civil war, where powerful families with royal blood in their veins basically tore the country apart, fighting over who should be king. The Roses bit comes from the badges of the two main families duking it out. The House of Lancaster, who supposedly used a red rose, and the House of York, who used a white rose. Now, historians will tell you they weren't actually flinging roses at each other on the battlefield, and the whole red versus white rose thing was probably played up a lot more afterwards, especially by Shakespeare. But it's a catchy name, and it stuck. So, how did England get itself into such a royal tangle? To really get it, we need to rewind the clock a bit, even before the first arrow was loosed or the first sword was drawn in these particular wars. The seeds of this conflict were sown way back with King Edward III. Now, Edward III was a pretty successful king, reigned for a long time, had a whole bunch of sons. And that's where the trouble starts, indirectly. Lots of sons mean lots of potential claimants to the throne down the line, especially if the main line of succession gets a bit wobbly. His eldest son, the famous Black Prince, died before Edward III did, so the crown passed to the Black Prince's young son, Richard II. Richard II. Well, he wasn't the most popular king. He had his favorites, spent a lot of money, and generally rubbed a lot of powerful nobles the wrong way. One of the nobles he really upset was his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who was the son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, another of Edward III's sons. In 1399, while Richard II was off in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke came back from exile. Richard had banished him and pinched his inheritance, gathered support, and basically nabbed the throne. Richard II was forced to abdicate and later died in captivity, probably murdered. So, Henry Bolingbroke became King Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. This is super important because even though Henry IV had a claim to the throne, he was Edward III's grandson after all. It wasn't the most direct claim if you followed strict primogeniture, that idea that the eldest son and his line always come first. There was another branch of Edward III's family, descended from his third son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, whose line, through marriage, eventually passed to the Mortimer family and then to the House of York. Their claim, by some reckonings, was stronger. But Henry IV had the throne, and possession is 9/10 of the law, right? Henry IV had a tough reign, lots of rebellions, but he held on. His son, Henry V, was a rock star, the great hero of the Battle of Agincourt against the French in the 100 Years' War. He was popular, strong, and looked like he was going to conquer France. Things were looking up for the Lancastrians. He even married the French king's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and their son was supposed to inherit both England and France. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? Well, fairy tales have a habit of going sour. Henry V died young in 1422, leaving his baby son, Henry VI, to inherit the throne. And this, my friends, is where the real problems that directly led to the Wars of the Roses began to brew. A baby king means powerful nobles jostling for influence during the regency, and Henry VI, even when he grew up, wasn't exactly cut out for the cutthroat world of 15th century politics. He was pious, gentle, easily led, and, crucially, prone to bouts of severe mental illness that left him completely incapable of ruling for long periods. That's a recipe for disaster in a kingdom that needed a strong hand at the tiller, especially with a costly and increasingly unsuccessful war still dragging on in France. The stage was being set for a serious challenge to Lancastrian rule. So we've got King Henry VI on the throne, a well-meaning but ultimately weak and mentally fragile ruler. While he was often lost in his own world, the kingdom was being run, or misrun depending on who you asked, by a clique of powerful nobles, chief among them the Duke of Suffolk, and later the Duke of Somerset. These guys weren't universally popular, and many felt they were lining their own pockets and mishandling the war in France, which England was steadily losing. All those glorious gains made by Henry V were slipping away, and with them a lot of national pride, and for the nobles, valuable French lands and incomes. Now, remember that other family with a strong claim to the throne. The House of York. The main man for the Yorkists at this point was Richard, Duke of York. He was a direct descendant of Edward III through two of his sons, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, his third son, and Edmund, Duke of York, his fourth son. This gave him a seriously impressive royal pedigree. In fact, if you went by strict hereditary succession, Richard of York arguably had a better claim to the throne than Henry VI, whose Lancastrian line came from John of Gaunt, Edward III's fourth surviving son to have children. Lionel was senior. Richard of York wasn't just some distant cousin with a fancy family tree. He was one of the most powerful and wealthy nobles in England. He'd served as a commander in France and later as Lieutenant of Ireland. He was seen by many as a competent and capable leader, a stark contrast to the ineffective Henry VI and his unpopular advisors. As things got worse in England, losses in France, economic problems, general discontent, more and more people started looking to York as a potential alternative, or at least as someone who could sort things out. A key figure who really threw fuel on the fire was Henry VI's wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. She was French, which didn't make her popular with everyone to begin with, especially as England was losing the war to France. But more than that, she was fiercely protective of her husband's crown, and later her son's inheritance. She was strong-willed, politically savvy, and utterly determined to keep the Lancastrians in power. She saw Richard of York as a direct threat, and did everything she could to sideline him and his supporters. This personal animosity between Margaret and York and their respective factions became a major driving force of the conflict. The situation really started to escalate in the early 1450s. England lost almost all its territories in France by 1453, a massive blow. The government was deeply in debt. There was widespread discontent. And then, in 1453, Henry VI had a complete mental breakdown. He became totally catatonic, unable to speak or recognize anyone, not even his newborn son, Edward of Westminster. This was a crisis. Someone had to rule. With the king incapacitated, a power vacuum opened up. Richard of York, with his strong claim and powerful allies, like the influential Neville family, including Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and his even more famous son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, later known as Warwick the Kingmaker, was appointed protector of the realm. He basically became the regent, running the country while Henry was unwell. York used his time as protector to try and reform the government and bring some order. He also took the opportunity to sideline his enemies, particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a leading Lancastrian and a favorite of Queen Margaret. But then, just over a year later, in late 1454 or early 1455, Henry VI suddenly recovered from his mental stupor. Just like that, he was back. And guess who was back in favor? Somerset. Queen Margaret, who deeply distrusted York, made sure of that. York was dismissed as protector and his reforms were overturned. He and his allies found themselves out in the cold and probably fearing for their safety. They felt they had no choice but to take a stand. The simmering tensions were about to boil over into open conflict. The stage was set for the first real clash of arms in what we now call the Wars of the Roses. So Richard, Duke of York, and his allies, including the powerful Neville family, Salisbury and Warwick, felt they'd been pushed too far. After Henry VI recovered and Queen Margaret and the Duke of Somerset were back in control, York and his mates were pretty much persona non grata at court. They probably figured it was only a matter of time before their enemies made a move against them. So they decided to act first. In May 1455, York, Salisbury, and Warwick gathered their forces and marched towards London. Their stated aim wasn't to depose King Henry VI, at least not yet, not openly. They claimed they just wanted to remove the king's evil counselors, particularly their arch-rival, the Duke of Somerset, who they blamed for all the country's problems and for turning the king against them. The king, with Somerset and other loyal Lancastrians like the Duke of Buckingham and Lord Clifford, raised his own army to meet them. The two sides clashed at the town of St. Albans, just north of London. It wasn't a massive battle by later standards, more like a violent street fight that escalated. The Yorkists, led by the militarily experienced Warwick, managed to break through the Lancastrian defenses. The key outcome of this first Battle of St. Albans was the death of several prominent Lancastrians, including the Duke of Somerset himself. With his main rival dead, Richard of York had achieved his immediate goal. King Henry VI was also captured, or perhaps found, wandering around in a bit of a daze, possibly injured. With the king in their hands and Somerset out of the picture, York was back in a position of power. He was reappointed protector of the realm, as Henry VI soon relapsed into another bout of mental incapacity. For a while, it seemed like York might be able to stabilize the kingdom. He tried to govern fairly, but the bitterness and mistrust ran too deep. Queen Margaret, in particular, was absolutely incandescent with rage over Somerset's death and York's ascendancy. She was a formidable opponent and was determined to protect her son Edward's claim to the throne and to avenge the Lancastrian losses. The next few years were a period of uneasy peace, punctuated by attempts at reconciliation that never really stuck. There was a famous Love Day procession in London in 1458, where Lancastrian and Yorkist lords walked hand in hand to St. Paul's Cathedral as a show of unity. But it was all for show. Beneath the surface, the plotting and maneuvering continued. Queen Margaret was busy building up support for the Lancastrian cause, especially in the Midlands and the North, while York and the Nevilles consolidated their power base. The truce inevitably broke down. By 1459, both sides were arming again. Queen Margaret, feeling strong enough, accused York and his allies of treason. The Yorkists, seeing the writing on the wall, took to the field. This led to a series of engagements. At the Battle of Blore Heath in Staffordshire, a Yorkist force under the Earl of Salisbury managed to defeat a larger Lancastrian army. It was a hard-fought victory, but it wasn't decisive. Soon after, the Yorkist luck seemed to run out. At a confrontation near Ludford Bridge in Shropshire, a significant portion of Warwick's troops, who had been brought over from the garrison at Calais, which Warwick commanded, suddenly deserted when they realized they were about to fight against their lawful king, Henry VI, who was present with the Lancastrian army. This was a disaster for the Yorkists. York himself fled to Ireland, while his eldest son, Edward, the future Edward IV, Salisbury, and Warwick made a dash for Calais, which remained a Yorkist stronghold. It looked like the Yorkist cause was finished. Queen Margaret and the victorious Lancastrians convened a parliament at Coventry, sometimes called the Parliament of Devils by Yorkist sympathizers, which attainted, basically declared as traitors and stripped of all lands and titles, York and his leading supporters. Their estates were confiscated. The Lancastrians were firmly back in the saddle. But this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. York, Salisbury, and Warwick were down, but they weren't out. From their respective exiles in Ireland and Calais, they began plotting their return, and the wars were about to enter an even more intense and bloody phase. So, after the disaster at Ludford Bridge and the Parliament of Devils, Richard, Duke of York, was holed up in Ireland, while his son Edward, Earl of March, along with the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, had made it to Calais. Calais, that little English foothold across the Channel in France, was Warwick's power base, and it became the launching pad for the Yorkist comeback. Warwick, often called the Kingmaker, though that nickname probably came a bit later, was a master of propaganda and a pretty skilled military commander. He spent his time in Calais building support, making connections, and preparing for an invasion. He even used his fleet to carry out a bit of piracy, which was great for morale and for funding the cause, though probably not so great for the merchants whose ships got raided. In June 1460, Warwick, Salisbury, and Edward, Earl of March, York's son, remember him, he's going to be important, landed in Kent, a county known for its rebellious streak and general dissatisfaction with Henry II's government. They were met with a surprisingly warm welcome. People were fed up with the Lancastrian regime, the ongoing losses in France, the 100 Years' War was still sputtering along, and the general feeling of instability. The Yorkists, with Warwick leading the charge, marched on London, which opened its gates to them. Once again, they claimed they weren't there to depose King Henry VI, just to rescue him from his evil advisers and reform the government. It's a familiar tune, isn't it? With London secured, they headed north to confront the Lancastrian forces. The two armies met at Northampton in July 1460. This battle was notable for a couple of things. Firstly, it rained heavily, which apparently made the Lancastrian cannons pretty useless. Secondly, and more decisively, one of the Lancastrian commanders, Lord Grey of Ruthin, switched sides mid-battle and ordered his men to help the Yorkists cross the Lancastrian defenses. Treachery was a common theme in these wars. The result was a swift Yorkist victory. Several key Lancastrian nobles were killed, including the Duke of Buckingham. And once again, King Henry VI was captured. Now, with King Henry as their prisoner for the second time, Richard, Duke of York, felt bold enough to make his big move. He returned from Ireland and, in October 1460, dramatically marched into Parliament, walked up to the empty throne, and placed his hand upon it, clearly indicating his intention to claim the crown for himself. This was a step too far for many, even some of his own supporters. While they might have agreed that Henry VI was a terrible king and that York should run the country, actually deposing an anointed king was a massive deal. It went against all the established order and the idea of divine right. The lords in Parliament were shocked and didn't immediately acclaim him king. After much debate, a compromise was reached, known as the Act of Accord. Under this agreement, Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life. However, Richard, Duke of York, and his heirs would be recognized as Henry's successors, completely disinheriting Henry's own son, Edward of Westminster, also known as Edward, Prince of Wales. You can imagine how Queen Margaret of Anjou felt about this. Her son, disinherited. She was having absolutely none of it. She had escaped after Northampton and was now in the north of England and Wales, gathering a formidable Lancastrian army, determined to fight for her son's rights and destroy the Duke of York. She was not going to let this Act of Accord stand. Richard of York, now officially the heir to the throne, marched north with the Earl of Salisbury to deal with Margaret's growing forces. He seriously underestimated her strength and determination. In late December 1460, near York's castle at Sandal, his forces were drawn out and ambushed by a much larger Lancastrian army at the Battle of Wakefield. The battle was an unmitigated disaster for the Yorkists. Richard, Duke of York himself, was killed in the fighting. His 17-year-old son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was captured and brutally executed, possibly by Lord Clifford in revenge for Clifford's father's death at St. Albans. The Earl of Salisbury was also captured and executed shortly after. The heads of York, Rutland, and Salisbury were then impaled on spikes and displayed over Micklegate Bar, one of the main gates into the city of York, with a paper crown mockingly placed on Richard of York's head. It was a brutal and personal end for the man who had come so close to the throne. The Lancastrians had struck back, and hard. The Battle of Wakefield was a devastating blow for the Yorkist cause. With Richard, Duke of York, and the Earl of Salisbury dead, it looked like Queen Margaret and the Lancastrians had decisively crushed the rebellion. The heads of their enemies, mockingly displayed on the gates of York, sent a clear and brutal message. Margaret's army, flushed with victory, began to march south towards London, and they weren't exactly known for their gentle behavior. There were widespread reports of looting and pillaging by her northern troops, which didn't endear them to the people in the south. But the Yorkist cause wasn't entirely extinguished. Richard, Duke of York, might have been dead, but he had sons. And his eldest surviving son, Edward, Earl of March, now inherited his father's claim to the throne and the leadership of the Yorkist faction. Edward was only 18 years old at the time of Wakefield, but he was already showing signs of being a charismatic and capable military leader. very different from the unfortunate Henry VI. He was tall, handsome, and had a natural charm that could inspire loyalty. While Margaret was heading south, Edward was in the Welsh Marches, the border region between England and Wales, where the Yorkists had strong support. He heard the news of his father's and brother's deaths and knew he had to act quickly. He intercepted a Lancastrian army led by Jasper Tudor, Henry II's half-brother, and the Earl of Wiltshire, who were trying to join up with Queen Margaret. At the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire in early February 1461, Edward won a significant victory. There was a strange atmospheric phenomenon before this battle, a parhelion, or sundog, where it looked like there were 3 suns in the sky. Edward, ever the showman, used this to rally his troops, claiming it was a sign of divine favor and represented the Holy Trinity, or perhaps his father and his 2 dead brothers, though that interpretation is a bit of a stretch, given only 1 brother died at Wakefield. This sun in splendor became one of his personal badges. Meanwhile, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, who had not been at Wakefield, was trying to block Queen Margaret's advance on London. He met her forces at the Second Battle of St. Albans in mid-February, 1461. This time things didn't go so well for Warwick. The Lancastrians, perhaps with better tactics or just more ferocity, defeated him. Warwick was forced to retreat, and crucially, King Henry VI, who had been Warwick's prisoner, was recaptured by his own side. Queen Margaret was reunited with her husband. Now, with Henry VI back in her control and her army victorious, it seemed like London was at Margaret's mercy. But here's where things took another twist. The citizens of London were terrified of Margaret's northern army, with its reputation for plundering. They were also, by this point, probably more sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, especially after the brutality of Wakefield. They refused to open the city gates to Margaret. This delay gave Edward, Earl of March, his chance. Fresh from his victory at Mortimer's Cross, he linked up with Warwick, and their combined forces raced towards London. They got there before Margaret could make a decisive move. The Londoners welcomed Edward and Warwick with open arms. This was a critical moment. Edward, young, charismatic, and victorious, was in the capital. King Henry VI, even though rescued by his wife, was seen as a weak pawn. Warwick and other leading Yorkists decided to take a bold step. On March 4, 1461, in a council of Yorkist lords, Edward, Earl of March, was proclaimed King Edward IV of England. He wasn't waiting for a coronation or an Act of Parliament like his father had tried to do with the Act of Accord. He simply declared himself king, arguing that the Lancastrians had forfeited their right to rule by breaking the Act of Accord, by attacking and killing his father, the named heir. So now England had 2 kings, Henry VI, still alive and with Queen Margaret and her army, and the newly proclaimed Edward IV in London. This situation obviously couldn't last. It was going to have to be settled on the battlefield once and for all, or so they thought. The stage was set for one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. So Edward IV is the newly proclaimed king in London, but Henry VI and Queen Margaret are still very much at large with a powerful Lancastrian army. It's clear this whole 2 kings situation isn't going to work out peacefully. Edward IV, young and eager to secure his throne, knew he had to crush the Lancastrian forces decisively. He gathered his army, which included the formidable Earl of Warwick and his retainers, and marched north to confront them. The Lancastrians, led by figures like the Duke of Somerset, son of the one killed at First St. Albans, and Sir Andrew Trollope, a very experienced soldier who had switched from the Yorkist side, had a huge army, possibly outnumbering Edward's. They took up a strong position near the village of Towton in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, March 29, 1461. The Battle of Towton was fought in horrific conditions. A blizzard was raging, with snow and sleet blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian soldiers. This actually gave the Yorkists an unexpected advantage. The Yorkist archers, commanded by Lord Fauconberg, let loose a volley of arrows with the wind behind them. Because the Lancastrians couldn't see clearly due to the snow, they misjudged the range, and their return volleys fell short. The Yorkists, cleverly, didn't waste their own arrows. Instead, they advanced, picked up the fallen Lancastrian arrows, and fired them back. The battle then descended into a brutal, grinding hand-to-hand melee that lasted for hours, some say as long as 10 hours. It was an incredibly savage and bloody affair, with no quarter given on either side. The sheer scale of the fighting was immense, possibly involving anywhere from 50,000 to 75,000 men in total, though exact numbers are always hard to come by for medieval battles. This was personal, this was for the crown, and both sides were utterly committed. Eventually, late in the day, fresh Yorkist reinforcements under the Duke of Norfolk arrived and attacked the Lancastrian flank. This proved to be the decisive moment. The Lancastrian line began to crumble, and then it broke completely. What followed was a rout and a massacre. Fleeing Lancastrian soldiers were cut down in their hundreds, or even thousands. Many tried to escape across a nearby river, the Cock Beck, but a small bridge there apparently collapsed under the weight of men in armor, or became a bottleneck. The river was said to have run red with blood, and men were reportedly able to cross it by walking on the bodies of the dead and dying. It's a horrifying image. The casualties at Towton were staggering, making it arguably the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Estimates vary wildly, but some contemporary accounts suggest tens of thousands were killed, possibly as many as 28,000, though modern historians tend to think it was lower, perhaps closer to 10,000 to 20,000 in total, killed and wounded. Even the lower estimates are horrific for a single day's fighting. The fields around Towton were littered with corpses for days afterwards. Mass graves have since been discovered, providing grim evidence of the slaughter. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and their son, Prince Edward, had not been at the battle itself, but were nearby. When news of the devastating defeat reached them, they knew they had to flee. They escaped north, eventually making their way to Scotland, seeking refuge and hoping to regroup. Edward IV, now undisputed, militarily at least, king, had won a crushing victory. The Lancastrian cause seemed utterly broken. Many of its leading nobles were dead or in exile. Edward returned to London in triumph and was formally crowned King Edward IV in June 1461. He was young, dynamic, and looked like the strong ruler England desperately needed after years of Henry VI's weak reign. The victory at Towton was a pivotal moment. It firmly established Edward IV on the throne and marked a major shift in the Wars of the Roses. But as with everything in these wars, it wasn't the final chapter. The Lancastrian threat, though severely weakened, still flickered, particularly with Queen Margaret and Prince Edward alive and determined to reclaim their inheritance. The kingmaker, Warwick, was also a powerful figure whose loyalty Edward would need to maintain. The peace won at such a terrible cost at Towton would prove to be fragile. So Edward IV is king, fresh from his bloody victory at Towton. He's young, just 19 when he was proclaimed, handsome, and a proven military commander. For many in England, he must have seemed like a breath of fresh air after the disastrous reign of Henry VI. His immediate tasks were to consolidate his power, deal with the remaining pockets of Lancastrian resistance, and try to bring some stability back to a kingdom that had been tearing itself apart. For the first few years of his reign, Edward did a pretty good job. He was energetic and decisive. He rewarded his loyal supporters with lands and titles, and he dealt relatively leniently with some of his former enemies, hoping to win them over. There were still Lancastrian diehards holding out, especially in the north of England and in Wales, often with support from Scotland, where Henry II's Queen Margaret and Prince Edward had fled. Queen Margaret was relentless, constantly trying to stir up trouble and find allies, even making deals with England's old enemy, France. Edward and his key ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, spent a good deal of time mopping up these remaining Lancastrian strongholds. Battles like Hedgeley Moor and Hexham in 1464 pretty much crushed the last significant Lancastrian field armies in England for a while. Eventually, in 1465, the unfortunate Henry VI himself was captured. He'd been wandering around in disguise in the north, a pathetic figure. He was brought to London and imprisoned in the Tower. With Henry locked away, Edward IV's throne seemed much more secure. Now, Warwick the kingmaker had been absolutely instrumental in putting Edward IV on the throne. He was immensely powerful, with vast estates, a huge network of retainers, and considerable political influence. He probably expected to be the main power behind the throne, guiding the young king and shaping policy, especially foreign policy. Warwick was keen on an alliance with France, and he was busy trying to negotiate a marriage for Edward IV with a French princess, Bona of Savoy, who was the sister-in-law of King Louis IX of France. This was all standard medieval diplomacy, strategic marriages to seal alliances. But Edward IV had other ideas. He was his own man, and he wasn't about to be Warwick's puppet. And in 1464, while Warwick was deep in negotiations with the French, Edward dropped a bombshell. He announced that he had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. Now Elizabeth Woodville was problematic from Warwick's point of view, and indeed from the point of view of many of the established nobility. She was English, not a foreign princess who could bring a useful alliance. She was a widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage. And while her mother was from a noble European house, her father was from a relatively minor gentry family that had risen through service. Crucially, she came with a huge family, lots of brothers, sisters, and other relatives who were all eager to benefit from their new connection to the king. Edward IV was clearly smitten with Elizabeth. She was famously beautiful. But marrying her was a political blunder in many ways. It infuriated Warwick, who felt humiliated that his French negotiations had been completely undermined. It also annoyed many of the other powerful Yorkist nobles, who saw the Woodville family, often referred to as the new men, suddenly getting all the best jobs, titles, and marriages, pushing aside the established families who had fought and bled for the Yorkist cause. The Woodvilles were seen as upstarts, greedy and grasping, and their rapid rise created a lot of resentment at court. Edward IV seemed determined to rule in his own right and not be overly reliant on the old guard like Warwick. He started promoting men loyal to him personally, including many of Elizabeth Woodville's relatives. This gradually created a rift between the king and his once powerful kingmaker. Warwick found his influence waning, his advice ignored, and his ambitions for a French alliance thwarted. Edward, instead, started to lean towards an alliance with Burgundy, France's main rival. This was a direct slap in the face to Warwick's foreign policy. The tension between Edward IV and Warwick simmered for several years. Warwick was a proud and ambitious man, and he wasn't going to take this perceived slight lying down. He started to feel that the king he had helped create was now ungrateful and was sidelining him in favor of these Woodville upstarts. This growing discontent would eventually lead Warwick to do the unthinkable, turn against the king he had made. The stage was being set for another dramatic reversal of fortune in these ever-turbulent wars. So the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, is feeling increasingly sidelined and disrespected by King Edward IV, the very man he helped put on the throne. The rise of the Woodville family, Edward's secret marriage, and the shift in foreign policy away from Warwick's preferred French alliance. It all added up. Warwick was not a man to be trifled with, and he began to plot. His first major move was to try and gain more direct influence over the king by marrying his eldest daughter, Isabel Neville, to Edward IV's younger brother George, Duke of Clarence. Now Clarence was ambitious himself, and perhaps a bit unstable and easily led. He felt, like Warwick, that he wasn't getting the recognition or power he deserved from his older brother, King Edward. The king actually forbade this marriage, seeing it, quite rightly, as a dangerous concentration of power in Warwick and Clarence's hands. But Warwick and Clarence went ahead with it anyway, in secret, in Calais, in 1469. This was a direct act of defiance. With Clarence now his son-in-law, Warwick instigated a series of rebellions in the north of England, using popular discontent over local grievances as a cover for his own political maneuvering. He even issued manifestos denouncing the king's evil counselors, meaning the Woodvilles and their allies, very much echoing the language that Edward's own father had used against Henry II's government. While Edward IV was busy dealing with these northern uprisings, Warwick and Clarence landed in England with troops. In July 1469, at the Battle of Edgecote Moor, Warwick's forces, though he wasn't there in person, defeated a royal army. More significantly, they managed to capture King Edward IV himself shortly afterwards. It was an astonishing turn of events. The kingmaker had, in effect, unmade his king. Warwick tried to rule in Edward's name, much like Richard of York had tried to do with Henry VI. He executed some of his key enemies, including Elizabeth Woodville's father and brother, Earl Rivers and John Woodville. But he quickly found that ruling without a cooperative king or widespread noble support was incredibly difficult. The country descended into further disorder. Many nobles were loyal to Edward, and they weren't happy with Warwick's high-handed actions. Warwick soon realized he couldn't hold on to power this way. He was forced to release Edward IV, and a very uneasy reconciliation was patched up. But the peace didn't last. By early 1470, Warwick and Clarence were plotting again. Another rebellion, this time in Lincolnshire, known as the Battle of Lusacote Field, supposedly because the fleeing rebels threw off their coats to run faster, was quickly crushed by Edward IV. This time, Edward had evidence of Warwick and Clarence's direct involvement. The game was up for them. They were declared traitors and forced to flee the country. And where did they go? To the court of King Louis XI of France, the very same Louis XI with whom Warwick had previously tried to negotiate an alliance for Edward. Now, Louis XI of France was a cunning and manipulative ruler, often called the universal spider because of the webs of intrigue he wove. He saw a golden opportunity to stir up trouble for his rival, Edward IV of England. And who else was at the French court, seeking refuge and support? None other than Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir. In one of the most extraordinary diplomatic U-turns in history, Louis XV managed to reconcile these bitter enemies. Warwick the Kingmaker, who had been instrumental in deposing Henry VI, and Queen Margaret, whose Lancastrian supporters Warwick had fought and killed. It was a truly bizarre alliance, born entirely of shared hatred for Edward IV. To seal the deal, Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, Isabel's sister, was betrothed to Margaret's son, Prince Edward. The plan was simple. Invade England, restore Henry VI to the throne, who would effectively be a puppet for Warwick and Margaret, and then England, under this new regime, would ally with France against Burgundy, Edward IV's ally. In September 1470, Warwick and Clarence, with French backing, landed in England. Edward IV was caught off guard. Many of his troops were in the north dealing with yet another rebellion, possibly instigated by Warwick's allies. Crucially, one of Warwick's brothers, John Neville, Marquess Montague, who had previously been loyal to Edward, suddenly switched sides and declared for Warwick and Henry VI. This was a devastating blow. Edward IV found his support melting away. Realizing his position was hopeless, he was forced to flee England in a hurry, seeking refuge in Burgundy with his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. So Henry VI is back on the throne, thanks to Warwick the Kingmaker and an unholy alliance with Queen Margaret of Anjou. This readeption period, however, was built on shaky foundations. Warwick was really the one in charge, with poor Henry VI being little more than a figurehead. Clarence, Edward IV's brother, who had sided with Warwick, was probably feeling a bit uneasy too. He had helped depose his own brother, but what was his future role going to be in this new Lancastrian regime? And the alliance between Warwick and Margaret was purely one of convenience. Deep down, they still loathed each other. Meanwhile, Edward IV wasn't just sitting idly by in Burgundy. He was a determined and resourceful man. His brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was initially hesitant to help him. Charles was wary of getting dragged into England's messy internal politics, and he was also technically at peace with France, who had backed Warwick's invasion. However, when France declared war on Burgundy, as per their agreement with Warwick and Margaret, Charles decided that supporting Edward IV's return might be a good way to destabilize the new Lancastrian-French alliance. So, with some financial backing and a small force provided by Charles the Bold, Edward IV set sail for England in March 1471. He landed at Ravenspurn in Yorkshire, a significant spot as it was the same place Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, had landed when he came to depose Richard II. Initially, Edward claimed he was only coming back to reclaim his dukedom of York, not the crown. This was a clever tactic to avoid alarming people too quickly and to gather support. As he marched south, his army grew. Many people were disillusioned with Warwick's rule and the renewed Lancastrian regime. The North, traditionally Lancastrian, didn't rise against him as much as might have been expected. And crucially, his brother George, Duke of Clarence, had a change of heart. Realizing he probably had a better future under his brother Edward than under Warwick and the Lancastrians, who might never fully trust him, Clarence deserted Warwick and rejoined Edward IV with his forces. This was a huge boost for Edward and a massive blow to Warwick. Warwick, now facing a resurgent Edward IV and the defection of Clarence, gathered his army and marched out of London to confront him. The two forces met at Barnet, just north of London, on Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1471. The battle was fought in thick fog, which caused a lot of confusion. At one point, some of Warwick's men mistakenly attacked another contingent of their own side, led by the Earl of Oxford, because they mistook Oxford's badge, a star with streams, for Edward IV's badge, a sun in splendor. This led to cries of "treason," and Oxford's men, thinking they were being betrayed, fled the field. The fighting was fierce and confused, but eventually Edward IV's forces gained the upper hand. Warwick the kingmaker, the man who had made and unmade kings, was killed trying to escape the battlefield. His brother, Marquis Montague, who had deserted Edward earlier, was also killed. The Battle of Barnet was a decisive victory for Edward IV. It eliminated his most powerful opponent and shattered the readeption government. But Edward wasn't out of the woods yet. On the very same day as the Battle of Barnet, Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, now a young man of 17, finally landed in England at Weymouth with a force of French mercenaries. They had been delayed by bad weather in the Channel. When they heard the news of Warwick's defeat and death at Barnet, Margaret was reportedly devastated and wanted to return to France. But her son, Prince Edward, and other Lancastrian lords persuaded her to fight on. They still had a substantial army and support in the West Country. Edward IV, knowing he had to act fast before Margaret could gather more support or link up with other Lancastrian sympathizers, especially those in Wales led by Jasper Tudor, raced westwards with his victorious army. He was determined to prevent Margaret from crossing the River Severn and reaching Wales. The final decisive clash of this phase of the wars came at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire on May 4th, 1471, less than 3 weeks after Barnet. The Lancastrians, tired from forced marches and unable to cross the Severn, were forced to give battle. Edward IV again showed his military skill. The Lancastrian army was comprehensively defeated. Tragically for the Lancastrian cause, young Prince Edward of Westminster, their heir and great hope, was killed either during the battle or, according to some accounts, murdered shortly afterwards by Yorkist lords, possibly even by Clarence and Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. This was a devastating blow. The direct Lancastrian line was now effectively extinguished. Many other leading Lancastrian nobles were also killed or executed after the battle, including the Duke of Somerset. Queen Margaret of Anjou was captured a few days later. With the Lancastrian field army destroyed, their heir dead, and Queen Margaret a prisoner, Edward IV returned to London in triumph. And shortly after his return, on the night of May 21st, 1471, the unfortunate ex-King Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official cause was melancholy, but it's widely believed and highly probable that he was murdered on Edward IV's orders. With Henry II and his son both dead, there was no obvious Lancastrian claimant left to challenge Edward. The victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury and the deaths of Warwick, Prince Edward, and Henry VI seemed to bring the Wars of the Roses to a decisive end. Edward IV was firmly back on the throne, his enemies crushed. England could finally look forward to a period of peace and stability under a strong and capable Yorkist king. Or so it seemed. So, after the bloody battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471, Edward IV was back on the throne, and this time it looked like he was there to stay. His main rivals were dead. Warwick the Kingmaker, the Lancastrian heir Prince Edward of Westminster, and finally, poor old Henry VI himself. Queen Margaret of Anjou was his prisoner. She was eventually ransomed by Louis XV of France and returned to her homeland, never to trouble England again. The Lancastrian cause seemed utterly broken. Edward IV's second reign, from 1471 until his death in 1483, was, for the most part, a period of relative peace and stability for England, especially compared to the chaos that had gone before. He was a capable ruler when he put his mind to it. He focused on restoring royal authority, improving the crown's finances, which were in a terrible state, and promoting trade and commerce. He was known for his charm and affability, but he could also be ruthless when necessary. He learned from some of his earlier mistakes. While he continued to favor his wife, Elizabeth Woodville's family, he also made efforts to reconcile with some of the formerly Lancastrian nobles, trying to build a broader base of support. He was also pretty good at managing Parliament and getting them to grant him the funds he needed. He even launched a brief, largely symbolic invasion of France in 1475, which didn't achieve much militarily but did result in a lucrative peace treaty with Louis XI, the Treaty of Picquigny, where Louis agreed to pay Edward a hefty annual pension. This was a smart move. It brought in cash without the massive expense and risk of a full-blown war. Edward was also a patron of the arts and learning. William Caxton set up England's first printing press during his reign, a hugely significant development for the spread of knowledge and literature. The court was generally seen as quite glamorous and sophisticated under Edward. However, despite the outward appearance of stability, there were still underlying tensions and potential sources of trouble. The Woodville family remained widely unpopular with many of the established nobility, who saw them as greedy and power-hungry. Their influence over the king was a constant source of resentment. And then there were Edward's own brothers. George, Duke of Clarence, who had betrayed Edward by siding with Warwick and then betrayed Warwick by rejoining Edward, was a perennial problem. He was ambitious, resentful, and seemed to be constantly plotting. He made a series of increasingly unwise moves, including allegedly dabbling in necromancy and spreading rumors that Edward IV was illegitimate. Eventually, Edward lost patience. In 1478, Clarence was arrested, tried for treason, with Edward himself personally accusing him in Parliament, and condemned to death. According to tradition and Shakespeare, he was privately executed in the Tower of London by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a rather distinctive if grim way to go. Whether the wine part is true or not, he was definitely executed, and it showed that Edward IV was prepared to be ruthless even with his own family, to maintain his authority. Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was a very different character. He had remained fiercely loyal to Edward throughout all the turmoil. He was a capable military commander and administrator, and Edward entrusted him with significant power, particularly in the north of England, where he was responsible for defending the border against the Scots. Richard was, by all contemporary accounts, at least before he became king himself, seen as a loyal, pious, and effective nobleman. He seemed to be the model of a loyal younger brother. For about 12 years, England enjoyed a period of relative calm under Edward IV. The economy improved, royal authority was strong, and the old Lancastrian threat seemed to have faded away. Edward had two sons, Edward, the Prince of Wales, born in 1470, and Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473. So the Yorkist succession seemed secure. It looked like the Wars of the Roses were finally over. But then, in April 1483, Edward IV, still relatively young at the age of 40, suddenly fell ill and died. He had apparently overindulged in food and drink, or perhaps caught a chill after a fishing trip. His death was unexpected and threw everything into disarray once again. His eldest son, the new King Edward V, was only 12 years old. And a boy king, as England knew all too well from the reign of Henry VI, was a recipe for instability and power struggles among the nobility. The question now was, who would control the young king, and therefore the kingdom? The Woodville family, led by the Queen Mother Elizabeth Woodville, were determined to maintain their influence. But there was another powerful figure who had a very strong claim to be protector of the realm during the young king's minority. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's loyal and capable brother. The stage was set for yet another power struggle, one that would lead to one of the most controversial and mysterious episodes in English history: the fate of the princes in the Tower and the rise of Richard III. The Wars of the Roses, it turned out, were not quite finished after all. So King Edward IV is dead, quite suddenly, in 1483, and his 12-year-old son is now King Edward V. Whenever you have a child king, you know there's going to be a power struggle among the adults for control. And this time was no different. The big question was, who would be the protector of the realm and guide the young king? On one side, you had the Woodville family, led by the Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville. They had enjoyed immense power and influence during Edward IV's reign, and they were desperate to hang on to it. They wanted to ensure that young Edward V was crowned quickly so they could rule in his name. Her brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, was the young king's governor and was escorting him from Ludlow, where he had been living, to London for his coronation. On the other side, you had Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother. Richard had been a staunchly loyal supporter of Edward IV throughout his reign. He was a respected military commander and administrator, particularly in the north of England. According to Edward IV's will, though the details are a bit murky, Richard was named as protector of the realm during his nephew's minority. Richard and many of the old nobility deeply distrusted the Woodvilles, seeing them as ambitious upstarts who had too much influence. Richard of Gloucester was in the north when he heard of his brother's death. He immediately began to move south, gathering support. He met up with another powerful nobleman, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who also had grievances against the Woodvilles and quickly became Richard's key ally. Their first move was a decisive one. In late April 1483, Richard and Buckingham intercepted young King Edward V and his Woodville escort, including Earl Rivers and the king's half-brother, Richard Grey. They arrested Rivers, Grey, and other Woodville associates, claiming they were plotting against Gloucester and trying to seize power. Young Edward V was effectively taken into Richard's custody. Richard assured the young king that he was acting in his best interests and to protect him. When they reached London, Richard was formally confirmed as Lord Protector by the Royal Council. Elizabeth Woodville, terrified, fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, who was about 9 or 10 years old, and her daughters. Initially, it seemed like Richard of Gloucester was genuinely preparing for his nephew's coronation. The date was set for June, but things started to take a very different turn. Richard began to consolidate his power, arresting anyone he saw as a threat. One of his most prominent opponents was William, Lord Hastings, who had been a close friend and loyal supporter of Edward IV, but was wary of Gloucester's ambitions and remained loyal to Edward V. In a dramatic council meeting at the Tower of London in mid-June, Richard accused Hastings of treason, along with Jane Shore, Edward IV's former mistress, and others. Hastings was summarily executed without trial, a shocking and brutal move that sent a clear message. Then came the really controversial part. Richard started to put forward the idea that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The argument, promoted by a clergyman named Ralph Shaw in a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, was that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. In those days, a pre-contract was considered as binding as a marriage, meaning any subsequent marriage would be bigamous and invalid. If Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, then all their children, including young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were illegitimate and therefore had no claim to the throne. This was a bombshell. It effectively disinherited the two young princes. Around the same time, Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince, was persuaded to leave sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and join his brother Edward V in the royal apartments in the Tower of London, supposedly for their own safety and to prepare for Edward V's coronation. Once both boys were in the Tower, they were seen less and less frequently, and then, after the summer of 1483, they were never seen again. The fate of these princes in the Tower remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Did Richard have them murdered? Most historians believe so, though there is no definitive proof, and supporters of Richard III have argued for his innocence for centuries. With the princes declared illegitimate, and after a carefully orchestrated series of petitions from representatives of the three estates of the realm, the lords, the commons, and the clergy, urging him to take the crown, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accepted. On June 26, 1483, he was proclaimed King Richard III. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey in July, in a lavish ceremony. Richard III's reign had begun in a whirlwind of controversy, intrigue, and bloodshed. He had seized the throne from his nephew, and many people, especially in the south of England, where Woodville influence had been strong, were deeply suspicious and hostile. Almost immediately, rebellions began to spring up, often led by former supporters of Edward IV who were horrified by Richard's actions and the disappearance of the princes. Even Richard's key ally, the Duke of Buckingham, turned against him and led a major rebellion in the autumn of 1483. Buckingham's rebellion failed, and he was captured and executed. But the unrest showed just how precarious Richard III's hold on the crown really was. He was a capable ruler in many ways, but his reign was overshadowed from the very beginning by the manner of his accession and the fate of his nephews. The Wars of the Roses had entered yet another dark and uncertain chapter. So Richard III is king, but his crown sits uneasily on his head. The way he got it, by sidelining, and most likely eliminating, his young nephews, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, cast a long, dark shadow over his entire reign. While he had supporters, especially in the North where he was well respected, many people, particularly in the South and among those loyal to the memory of Edward IV, viewed him as a usurper and a tyrant. Richard III was, by many accounts, an energetic and capable ruler. He tried to promote justice and good governance. He passed laws that were seen as beneficial to ordinary people, such as reforms to the legal system to make it more accessible. He also took an interest in trade and was a patron of learning. He was clearly trying to establish himself as a legitimate and effective king. However, his reign was plagued by instability and conspiracies. The failed rebellion led by his former ally, the Duke of Buckingham, in late 1483, was a major blow, even though it was suppressed. It showed the depth of the opposition to his rule. Buckingham had even, it seems, started to promote the idea of another claimant to the throne, a relatively obscure figure named Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Now, who was this Henry Tudor? His claim to the throne was, to put it mildly, a bit tenuous. His mother was Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, Edward III's son, through John's affair with Catherine Swynford. The Beaufort line had been legitimized by Parliament, but specifically barred from inheriting the throne. So, Henry's Lancastrian connection was through a legitimized but barred female line. His father was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was the half-brother of King Henry VI. Edmund's mother, Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow, had secretly married a Welshman named Owen Tudor after Henry V's death. So Henry Tudor had a drop of royal blood from his father's side too, but it was through a rather unconventional route. Basically, by 1483, with Henry VI and his son Edward of Westminster both dead, Henry Tudor was, for many die-hard Lancastrians and those disaffected with Richard III, the best available candidate to rally around. He had spent most of his life in exile, mainly in Brittany and later in France, ever since Edward IV had seized the throne in 1471. He was a political unknown in England, but he represented a potential alternative to Richard III. Adding to Richard III's woes was a personal tragedy. In 1484, his only legitimate son and heir, Edward of Middleham, died suddenly. This was a devastating blow for Richard, both personally and politically, as it left the succession uncertain once again. His wife, Anne Neville, Warwick the Kingmaker's younger daughter, who had previously been married to the Lancastrian prince Edward of Westminster, talk about complicated family ties, also died in early 1485. Rumors, probably unfounded and spread by his enemies, even suggested Richard had poisoned her so he could marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, to try and secure his throne. All this turmoil and uncertainty created an opportunity for Henry Tudor. With support from the French court, who were always happy to cause trouble for England, and a growing number of disaffected English nobles and exiles, Henry began to plan an invasion. His cause was significantly boosted by a clever political move. He pledged to marry Elizabeth of York if he became king. This was a masterstroke. Elizabeth of York, as Edward IV's eldest daughter, had a very strong Yorkist claim to the throne in her own right, especially if her brothers were indeed dead. Marrying her would unite the rival houses of Lancaster, represented, however weakly, by Henry, and York, and hopefully bring an end to the decades of civil war. This promise won over many Yorkists who couldn't stomach Richard III, but still wanted to see Edward IV's line on the throne. In August 1485, Henry Tudor landed with a small army of English exiles and French mercenaries at Milford Haven in Wales. Wales was a good landing spot for him, as his Tudor ancestry gave him some local connections and support. As he marched inland, his forces grew. Many nobles were still hesitant to commit, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Richard III, who was a skilled and experienced military commander, quickly gathered his royal army and marched to meet the invader. The two armies finally confronted each other on August 22, 1485, near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth Field was to be the decisive clash that would, at long last, bring the main phase of the Wars of the Roses to an end. Richard III had a larger army, but loyalty was a very fluid concept in these wars. A key factor in the battle would be the stance of Lord Stanley and his brother, Sir William Stanley. The Stanleys commanded a powerful private army, and while Lord Stanley was officially on Richard's side, Richard even held Stanley's son hostage to ensure his loyalty. His wife was none other than Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. So, the Stanleys were in a very tricky position, and everyone was watching to see which side they would ultimately support. Their decision would be crucial. All right, so it's August 22nd, 1485, and the stage is set for the Battle of Bosworth Field. King Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England, is facing off against the challenger, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who has a pretty thin claim to the throne, but a lot of disgruntled nobles and foreign backing on his side. This battle is often seen as the one that finally brought the main bloody chapter of the Wars of the Roses to a close. Richard III had the larger army, probably around 10,000 to 12,000 men, compared to Henry Tudor's force of perhaps 5,000 to 8,000. Richard also had experienced commanders like the Duke of Norfolk. However, numbers aren't everything in medieval warfare, especially when loyalty is a major question mark. A huge wild card in this battle was the Stanley family. Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother, Sir William Stanley, commanded a significant force of several thousand men. Lord Stanley was officially with Richard III, but his wife was Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's very determined mother. Richard III was so suspicious of Stanley's loyalty that he was holding Stanley's son, Lord Strange, hostage. The Stanleys positioned their forces somewhat separately from both main armies, and everyone was on tenterhooks wondering which way they would jump, if at all. Their intervention could easily swing the battle. The battle began with the usual exchange of archery and an advance by Richard's forces, led by the Duke of Norfolk. The fighting was fierce. Richard III, whatever his faults in getting the crown, was a brave and experienced soldier. He was right there in the thick of it. Then came the crucial moment. Richard spotted Henry Tudor's banner across the field. Henry himself was not a renowned warrior. He was more of a politician and an administrator by nature. He was with a relatively small contingent of his troops. Richard, seeing a chance to end the battle and the war with one decisive blow, decided to lead a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor, aiming to kill him personally. It was an incredibly bold, almost reckless move. Richard and his household knights charged across the battlefield, cutting down several of Henry's men, including Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon. Richard himself is said to have unhorsed Sir John Cheney, a famously large and strong knight. He came within a sword's length of Henry Tudor. For a moment, it looked like Richard might actually succeed. But then, just as Richard was about to reach Henry, Sir William Stanley, who had been watching from the sidelines, finally made his move. He ordered his forces to attack, not in support of Henry, but directly against King Richard III. Stanley's intervention, right at this critical point, completely turned the tide. Richard's brave but outnumbered charge was overwhelmed. He was surrounded by Stanley's men and enemy soldiers. Accounts say he fought valiantly, refusing to flee even when offered a horse. He supposedly declared, "God forbid I should turn my back. I will die King of England." And die he did, cut down in the fierce fighting. His crown, which he had worn into battle, reportedly fell off and was later found under a hawthorn bush. With Richard III dead, his army lost heart and began to flee. The battle turned into a rout. Many of Richard's key supporters, including the Duke of Norfolk, were also killed. Lord Stanley is said to have picked up Richard's fallen circlet and placed it on Henry Tudor's head on the battlefield, symbolically crowning him King Henry VII, though the actual coronation would come later. The Battle of Bosworth Field was over. Richard III, the last Yorkist king and the last English king to die in battle, lay dead. Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant with a shaky pedigree, but now the victor on the field, was the new king. The immediate aftermath was, of course, securing power. Henry VII marched to London and was formally crowned in October 1485. One of his first and most important acts was to fulfill his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. This marriage, which took place in January 1486, was hugely symbolic. It was intended to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Henry even created a new emblem, the Tudor rose, which combined the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York to signify this union and the end of the conflict. Henry VII was a very different kind of king from those who had gone before. He wasn't a great warrior like Edward IV or Richard III. He was shrewd, cautious, and incredibly focused on establishing stability, restoring royal finances, and securing his dynasty. He knew his claim to the throne was weak, and that there were still many Yorkist sympathizers around who might try to challenge him. His reign would be marked by a careful consolidation of power and a determination to prevent any resurgence of the kind of aristocratic feuding that had caused the Wars of the Roses. The wars themselves might have ended at Bosworth, but their legacy and the need to deal with potential threats would shape Henry VII's rule for years to come. So Henry Tudor is now King Henry VII, largely thanks to his victory at Bosworth Field and the timely intervention of the Stanleys. His first and foremost task was to make sure he stayed king, because his claim to the throne, as we've discussed, wasn't exactly rock solid. He was a Lancastrian claimant, but the direct Lancastrian line was long gone. His victory was a matter of conquest and some clever political maneuvering as much as it was about hereditary right. One of his smartest moves, right at the start, was marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, in January 1486. This was a masterstroke of political symbolism. By marrying a Yorkist princess, Henry was uniting the two warring houses. Their children would have an undeniable claim to the throne, blending both Lancastrian and Yorkist blood. He even created the Tudor rose, a combination of the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, as a powerful symbol of this new unity and the end of the dynastic strife. But symbolism alone wasn't enough. Henry VII knew he had to be firm and shrewd to keep his crown. His reign was characterized by a careful, almost meticulous consolidation of royal power. He was determined to prevent the kind of overmighty nobles and private armies that had caused so much trouble during the Wars of the Roses. He dealt with potential rivals and threats decisively. He had any remaining Yorkist claimants with strong claims either imprisoned or, if they posed a direct threat, executed. For example, Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, and nephew of Edward IV and Richard III, who had a strong Yorkist claim, was kept imprisoned in the Tower of London for most of his life and eventually executed in 1499 after allegedly being involved in an escape plot. Henry was also very clever with money. The crown was virtually bankrupt after decades of war and mismanagement. Henry VII was famously frugal, some would say miserly, and very astute at managing royal finances. He avoided costly foreign wars as much as possible, preferring diplomacy and treaties. He strengthened royal administration, improved tax collection, and used various legal and financial means to increase the crown's wealth and reduce the power of the nobility. He imposed heavy fines for illegal retaining, nobles keeping private armies, and used bonds and recognizances, basically promises of good behavior backed by huge sums of money, to keep potentially troublesome nobles in line. If they stepped out of line, they faced financial ruin. It was a very effective, if sometimes unpopular, way of controlling the aristocracy. Despite his efforts, Henry VII's reign wasn't entirely free of challenges. The memory of the Yorkist kings was still strong, and there were several plots and pretenders who tried to unseat him. One of the most famous was Lambert Simnel, a young boy who was put forward by Yorkist conspirators in 1487. They claimed he was Edward, Earl of Warwick. The real one was still in the Tower. Simnel was even crowned king in Ireland, which was a Yorkist stronghold. Henry VII dealt with this threat decisively. He paraded the real Earl of Warwick through the streets of London to show Simnel was an impostor. Then, at the Battle of Stoke Field in June 1487, often considered the last real battle of the Wars of the Roses, Henry's forces crushed Simnel's army. Henry was surprisingly lenient with Simnel himself. Recognizing he was just a pawn, he gave him a job in the royal kitchens. A few years later, another more serious pretender emerged, Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower, supposedly having escaped from whatever fate befell his older brother. Warbeck was a much more convincing and charismatic figure than Simnel. He gained support from several European rulers who were hostile to Henry VII, including Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, Edward IV, and Richard III's sister, who was a bitter enemy of the Tudors. Warbeck made several attempts to invade England between 1495 and 1497, but they all failed. He was eventually captured, and after trying to escape, he was executed in 1499, along with the unfortunate Earl of Warwick, who was implicated in the same escape plot. By executing Warbeck and Warwick, Henry VII eliminated the last significant Yorkist pretenders. He had successfully weathered the storms and secured his dynasty. He also focused on building alliances through marriage. His eldest son, Arthur, Prince of Wales, was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, sealing an important alliance with Spain. When Arthur died young, Henry later arranged for Catherine to marry his second son, the future Henry VIII, though this would cause massive problems down the line, leading to the English Reformation. He also married his daughter Margaret to King James IV of Scotland, a move that would eventually lead to the union of the English and Scottish crowns a century later when their descendant, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England. Henry VII died in 1509, leaving a peaceful and solvent kingdom to his son, Henry VIII. He had successfully ended the Wars of the Roses, established a new dynasty, and laid the foundations for a stronger, more centralized English monarchy. He might not have been a glamorous or warlike king like some of his predecessors, but his cautious, pragmatic, and sometimes ruthless approach was exactly what England needed after decades of turmoil. He brought stability, and that was his greatest achievement. So Henry VII successfully navigated the treacherous waters left by the Wars of the Roses and managed to glue the kingdom back together. But what were the longer-term consequences of this whole bloody mess? And what was happening in the rest of the world while England was busy having its internal dynastic meltdown? One of the most significant consequences of the Wars of the Roses was the sheer devastation it caused, particularly to the English nobility. So many noble families were wiped out or had their lands confiscated. All those battles, St. Albans, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, Bosworth, they weren't just numbers. They represented the deaths of husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers from the leading families of the realm. This decimation of the old aristocracy, in a way, made it easier for Henry VII and subsequent Tudor monarchs to assert royal power. There were fewer overmighty subjects left with the independent wealth and private armies to challenge the crown. The Tudors were very keen to prevent the kind of baronial feuding that had led to the wars, and they largely succeeded. The wars also had a big impact on the English monarchy itself. The constant uncertainty and changes in who was king weakened the prestige of the crown for a while. But ultimately, the Tudors emerged with a much stronger, more centralized monarchy. Henry VII, as we saw, was all about restoring royal authority and finances. His son, Henry VIII, and granddaughter, Elizabeth I, would build on these foundations to create an even more powerful and iconic English monarchy. The idea of a strong, divinely ordained monarch got a boost, partly as a reaction against the chaos of the civil wars. People were tired of the instability and were willing to accept a stronger ruler if it meant peace. Economically, the wars were disruptive, but perhaps not as universally devastating as you might think for the common person, at least not directly all the time. Most of the fighting was done by the nobles and their retainers, and battles were often localized. However, the general instability, the breakdown of law and order in some areas, and the disruption to trade certainly didn't help the economy. Henry VII's focus on peace, stability, and promoting trade was crucial for England's recovery and future prosperity. Culturally, the Wars of the Roses left a lasting mark on the English imagination. They became a powerful symbol of civil strife and the dangers of a disputed succession. William Shakespeare, writing over a century later during the Tudor period, immortalized the conflict in his history plays like Henry VI, Parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. His portrayal of Richard III as a hunchbacked villain, while brilliant drama, has heavily influenced how that king has been perceived for centuries, even if modern historians question its accuracy. The Tudors, understandably, were very keen to promote a narrative that legitimized their own rule and painted the preceding period as one of chaos from which they had rescued England. Shakespeare's plays, in many ways, reflected this Tudor propaganda. Now, let's zoom out a bit. What was going on in the wider world while England was so internally preoccupied between roughly 1455 and 1487? It was actually a period of huge change and dynamism elsewhere. This was the late Renaissance in Europe. While England was fighting over who should wear the crown, Italy was flourishing with artists like Leonardo da Vinci, born 1452, and Botticelli. The printing press, invented by Gutenberg around 1440, was revolutionizing the spread of information and ideas across Europe. This had massive implications for learning, religion, and politics, though its full impact in England would be felt a bit later. In terms of exploration, this was a pivotal time. The Portuguese were pushing down the coast of Africa, seeking a sea route to the east. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and just a few years after Bosworth Field in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, would make his first voyage across the Atlantic, discovering the Americas, though, of course, people were already living there. This was the dawn of the age of exploration, which would completely reshape the global map and European power dynamics. England, bogged down in its internal conflicts, was a latecomer to this game of overseas expansion. It wasn't until Henry VII had established some stability that England could even begin to think about sponsoring voyages like John Cabot's in 1497. On the European continent, other major powers were consolidating. In France, after the end of the 100 Years' War, which England definitively lost during this period, with the loss of Bordeaux in 1453 effectively ending it, the French monarchy under kings like Louis XI was centralizing its power and expanding its territory. Spain was also unifying with the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. In 1492, they completed the Reconquista by capturing Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, and also famously expelled the Jews from Spain. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of German states, was a major force in Central Europe, and the Ottoman Empire in the East was a growing power, having captured Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire. This was a massive event that sent shockwaves through Christendom and shifted trade routes. So, while England was embroiled in its dynastic struggles, the rest of the world wasn't standing still. In fact, you could argue that England's internal weakness during the Wars of the Roses meant it missed out on some of the early opportunities of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. It was only once the Tudors had firmly established peace and a strong monarchy that England could start to catch up and eventually become a major global player in the centuries that followed. The Wars of the Roses, in a sense, cleared the decks for a new kind of England to emerge. When we look back at the Wars of the Roses, it's easy to get lost in the dates and battles, but it's the personalities that really bring this period to life. These weren't just abstract forces. They were real people with ambitions, fears, loyalties, and fatal flaws. Take King Henry VI. He's often portrayed as a saintly simpleton, more interested in prayer and study than in ruling. And there's some truth to that. He founded Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, showing a genuine commitment to learning. But his piety and gentleness were a disaster in a king during such a brutal age. His recurrent mental illness, which left him completely incapacitated for long stretches, created power vacuums that others were all too eager to fill. You can't help but feel a bit sorry for him, a man utterly unsuited for the crown he inherited as a baby. What if Henry VI had been a strong, decisive ruler like his father? Would the Wars of the Roses have even happened? It's a big question. Then there's his wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. She was the opposite of her husband, fierce, determined, and politically ruthless. She fought tooth and nail for her husband's crown and her son's inheritance. To her enemies, she was the she-wolf of France, a foreign meddler. To her supporters, she was a courageous leader. She certainly kept the Lancastrian cause alive through sheer force of will, even after devastating defeats. Her refusal to compromise, however, probably prolonged the conflict. Richard, Duke of York, is another pivotal figure. He had a strong claim to the throne, and many saw him as a capable alternative to Henry VI. Was he purely ambitious, or did he genuinely believe he was acting for the good of the kingdom? Probably a bit of both. His decision to formally claim the throne in 1460 was a bold gamble that ultimately cost him his life at Wakefield. But his claim lived on through his son, Edward IV. Edward IV himself was a fascinating character. Tall, handsome, a brilliant military commander, and a notorious womanizer. He won the throne through force of arms and then managed to hold on to it, mostly through a combination of charm, ruthlessness, and political skill. His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, while perhaps a romantic gesture, was a major political misstep that alienated key allies like Warwick. Yet his second reign brought much-needed stability. What if he hadn't died so young in 1483? Would the Tudor dynasty have ever come to power? And of course, Warwick the Kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. He was the ultimate overmighty subject. Immensely wealthy and powerful, he was instrumental in deposing Henry VI and enthroning Edward IV, and then instrumental in deposing Edward IV and briefly restoring Henry VI. His shifting loyalties and immense influence show just how much power individual nobles could wield. Was he a principled man trying to ensure good governance, or a power-hungry opportunist? Again, likely a mixture. His death at Barnet removed a major destabilizing force from English politics. Then we come to Richard III. No figure from this period is more controversial. Was he the monstrous hunchbacked villain of Shakespeare's play, who murdered his way to the throne, including his own young nephews? Or was he a loyal brother and capable administrator, a victim of Tudor propaganda after his death? The historical debate rages on. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower is the central mystery. If he didn't kill them, what happened to them, and if he did, was it a desperate act to secure a throne he believed was rightfully his, given the alleged illegitimacy of Edward IV's children? His 2-year reign was too short and too troubled to really show what kind of king he might have been in the long run. And finally, Henry VII, the ultimate winner. He came from relative obscurity, with a very shaky claim to the throne, and won it all on the battlefield at Bosworth. He was cautious, shrewd, and focused on security and financial stability. He wasn't a glamorous warrior king, but he was exactly what England needed to end the decades of civil war. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was a masterstroke, uniting the warring factions. His tight-fisted control over the nobility and royal finances laid the groundwork for the powerful Tudor monarchy that followed. The what-ifs of this period are endless. What if Henry V hadn't died young? What if Richard of York had won at Wakefield? What if Edward IV had lived another 20 years? What if Richard III had won at Bosworth? Each of these could have sent English history down a completely different path. One thing the Wars of the Roses definitely showed was the danger of a disputed succession and the immense power that a few key nobles could wield. It also highlighted the brutal reality of 15th century politics, where personal rivalries, ambition, and violence were often the deciding factors. The sheer human cost in terms of lives lost and the suffering of ordinary people caught in the crossfire, even if they weren't directly involved in most battles, the instability affected everyone, was immense. The desire for peace and strong, stable rule after all that bloodshed was a powerful force that helped the Tudors cement their power and usher in a new era for England. When we talk about the Wars of the Roses, it's easy to focus on the kings, queens, and powerful nobles duking it out. But what was life like for ordinary people during these tumultuous decades? And how exactly were these wars fought? For the average peasant or townsperson, the Wars of the Roses probably didn't mean constant, direct involvement in fighting. Most of the battles, while bloody, were relatively short-lived and fought by the nobles, their liveried retainers, private armies wearing their lord's badge or livery, and mercenaries. An ordinary farmer wasn't typically conscripted to fight in the same way they might have been for, say, the 100 Years' War against France, which was seen as a national conflict. These were, in many ways, dynastic squabbles fought by and among the elite. However, that doesn't mean ordinary people were unaffected. Far from it. The biggest impact was probably the general instability and breakdown of law and order in certain regions at certain times. When the king's authority was weak or contested, local lords could become petty tyrants, feuding with their neighbors, seizing land, and abusing their power without fear of punishment. This could make life very difficult and uncertain for those living under their control. Trade and agriculture could also be disrupted. Armies marching through the countryside would often live off the land, which is a polite way of saying they'd take food, livestock, and supplies from local villages, often without payment. This could be devastating for communities already living on the edge. Markets might be disrupted, and the general uncertainty could make people hesitant to invest or travel. There was also the psychological impact. Living through a period of civil war with news of battles, executions, and kings being overthrown must have been unsettling, to say the least. Loyalty was a dangerous game. If you backed the wrong horse, you could lose everything, from your property to your life, especially if you were a person of some standing. Even for commoners, being in a town or region associated with the losing side could bring reprisals. However, it's also important not to overstate the continuous devastation. England wasn't in a state of constant nationwide warfare for 30 years. There were long periods of relative peace between the major outbreaks of fighting. Life, for many, went on. People still farmed their land, plied their trades, got married, and had children. The fabric of society didn't completely unravel. Some areas of the country were barely touched by the fighting at all. The southeast and London, for example, while politically crucial, saw less direct military action than, say, the North or the Welsh Marches, where loyalties were fiercely contested and armies frequently campaigned. Now, what about the warfare itself? The Wars of the Roses were fought in a transitional period for military technology and tactics. Full-plate armor was at its zenith, making knights look like walking fortresses. But gunpowder weapons, like cannons and early handguns, were starting to make an appearance, though they were still quite primitive, unreliable, and slow to reload. Cannons were mostly used in sieges rather than being decisive on the open battlefield, though, as we saw at Northampton, rain could render even those ineffective. The longbow was still a hugely important weapon for the English. English archers were renowned throughout Europe, and a well-aimed volley of arrows could wreak havoc on advancing enemy formations, especially if they weren't well armored. Battles often started with an archery duel. The core of the armies was made up of men-at-arms, knights and gentry, heavily armored and fighting on foot in these wars rather than as cavalry, and archers. The nobles would raise these troops through a system of indentures, contracts where they agreed to provide a certain number of soldiers for a campaign. They also had their liveried retainers, men who wore their lord's badge and were loyal to him personally. This system of private armies, while useful for raising forces quickly, was also one of the reasons the wars were so prolonged and difficult to control. Powerful nobles had the means to wage war on their own terms. Henry VII would later crack down hard on this practice of livery and maintenance. Battles themselves were often brutal and bloody, especially when no quarter was given, meaning prisoners wouldn't be taken. The aim was often to kill or capture prominent enemy leaders, as this could cripple their cause. Treachery and switching sides were also common features. A key lord changing allegiance mid-battle, like Lord Stanley at Bosworth or Lord Grey at Northampton, could completely alter the outcome. This made commanders constantly nervous about the loyalty of their own troops and allies. Cavalry played a less dominant role in the major battles of the Wars of the Roses compared to earlier medieval warfare on the continent. Most of the fighting was done on foot. However, cavalry was still used for scouting, skirmishing, and, as Richard III tried at Bosworth, for a decisive charge against an enemy leader. Sieges of castles and fortified towns also occurred, but many of the key engagements were pitched battles in the open field. The campaigns were often quite mobile, with armies marching rapidly across the country to try and intercept their opponents or seize strategic locations like London. The weather, as seen at Towton, could also play a significant and unpredictable role. So, while the roses in the name might sound gentle, the reality of the warfare was anything but. It was a period of intense, personal, and often savage conflict that reshaped the English aristocracy and, ultimately, the English monarchy. So, as the dust settled after Bosworth Field and Henry VII began his careful, methodical reign, what was the ultimate legacy of these brutal, sprawling Wars of the Roses? How did 30 years of on-again, off-again civil war change England, and how did it pave the way for the famous Tudor dynasty that followed? Perhaps the most immediate and striking legacy was the sheer exhaustion of the kingdom. People were tired of war, tired of instability, and tired of a crown that seemed to pass back and forth like a game piece. This widespread desire for peace and strong, stable rule was something Henry VII understood and capitalized on. It allowed him to implement his often strict policies with less opposition than might otherwise have been the case. England was ready for a firm hand. The old feudal nobility, as we've touched on, was significantly weakened. So many great families had been decimated, their lands confiscated, their power diminished. This wasn't just about the number of deaths. It was about the breaking of the old patterns of loyalty and the immense power wielded by a few overmighty subjects, like Warwick the Kingmaker. Henry VII was determined that no single nobleman should ever again be powerful enough to make or unmake kings. He used financial controls, legal measures, and a keen sense of political maneuvering to keep the remaining aristocracy in check. This led to a much more centralized state, with power increasingly concentrated in the hands of the monarch and his chosen counselors, rather than being dispersed among powerful regional lords. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of power within England. The nature of the monarchy itself was also transformed. The Wars of the Roses had shown the dangers of a weak king, Henry VI, and a disputed succession. The Tudors, starting with Henry VII, worked hard to build up the mystique and authority of the crown. They were brilliant at propaganda, using symbols like the Tudor rose to emphasize unity and legitimacy. They projected an image of strength and divine approval. This laid the foundations for the powerful, almost absolutist tendencies seen later under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Economically, while the wars caused disruption, England's underlying economic strengths, its wool trade, its agriculture, eventually recovered and even began to flourish under the peace and stability provided by the Tudors. Henry VII was particularly good at promoting trade and managing the kingdom's finances, leaving a healthy treasury for his son. This financial stability was crucial for the ambitious projects of Henry VIII and the glories of the Elizabethan age. In terms of England's place in the world, the Wars of the Roses had been a period of relative international weakness and introspection. While other European powers like Spain and Portugal were launching the age of exploration, England was largely preoccupied with its internal struggles. Henry VII, once secure, began to cautiously dip England's toe into these waters, sponsoring John Cabot's voyage. But it was really under his Tudor successors that England would begin its journey towards becoming a major maritime and colonial power. The internal stability achieved after the wars was a necessary precondition for this outward expansion. Culturally, the memory of the Wars of the Roses lingered for a long time. It served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the horrors of civil war. This was something the Tudor monarchs were keen to emphasize, as it reinforced their own legitimacy as the dynasty that had brought peace. Shakespeare's history plays, written during Elizabeth I's reign, are a testament to the enduring fascination with this period and its larger-than-life characters, even if they often presented a Tudor-biased view of events. So, in essence, the Wars of the Roses, despite all their brutality and chaos, acted as a kind of crucible for England. They burned away much of the old feudal order, and from the ashes, a new, more centralized, and ultimately more powerful English state began to emerge under the Tudors. The path was bloody and winding, filled with tragedy and treachery, but it led to a period of remarkable transformation and achievement for England. The romantic-sounding Wars of the Roses were, in fact, a grim but pivotal chapter that closed one era of English history and opened the door to another. It set the stage for the Renaissance to truly flourish in England, for the English Reformation, for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and for the beginnings of a global empire. It was a painful birth, but it shaped the England that was to come. It's a complex story, the Wars of the Roses, not just a simple case of goodies versus baddies or one rose against another. It was a messy human drama played out on a national scale, driven by ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the ever-present question of who had the right to rule. From the gentle but ineffective Henry VI to the fierce Margaret of Anjou, the ambitious Richard of York, the charismatic Edward IV, the enigmatic Richard III, and the shrewd Henry Tudor. These individuals and many others shaped a defining period in English history. Their struggles, their victories, and their defeats didn't just decide who wore the crown. They reshaped the very fabric of English society and set the kingdom on a new course. It's a reminder that history is often made in the crucible of conflict, and that even the most turbulent times can pave the way for unexpected new beginnings.